So at this time, I'd like to welcome you to the April 21st Select Board meeting. And I will just review this again, just in case somebody's tuned in, that we are having this broadcast on a Zoom meeting in accordance with the emergency orders announced by Governor Charlie Baker to protect public health during the COVID-19 outbreak. This meeting will not be open to the public for physical attendance, and the select board members are calling in and logging in via Zoom conference. The meeting's being live streamed and cable broadcast by the Easton Community Access Television and on ECAT's website at www.eastoncat.org. The first item on this agenda is the standing update for COVID-19 response in Easton. Connor, if you would like to talk about that.
Sure, thank you, Dottie. So this update will be slightly more brief than the one provided at our last meeting. I'm just going to review some key items on behalf of the public health and public safety response. The chief and director committee won't be on this, but I've pulled this information together with them. So the Easton Emergency Management Association leadership continues to meet daily remotely to assess the ongoing impact of COVID locally, regionally, and nationally to inform what we're doing locally. We're continuing to work with our numerous working groups, which are cross-sector and have members not just from the town government, but from civic groups and other institutions in the area, hospitals, nonprofits, and things like that, so that we can make sure that we are working together as a community and not conducting ourselves in operational silos based on our place of employment. So as with the last update, I figured I would just give an update on where we are. Most people are probably acutely aware of this, but I'll start with the United States, work into the Commonwealth, and then Easton. The last time we had this meeting, I put the graph from Johns Hopkins University up here, but the scale is such now that it's pretty difficult to realize that, at least for the US cases. So this is just text-based. So as of today, the US remains the epicenter of the global pandemic. We have 804,000 cases. We have more than 43,000 Americans dead of COVID. Less than 2 months ago, on February 26th, the United States had 15 cases, and I thought that listing in this way was helpful to understand kind of the scale and speed of the spread here. We passed 100 cases on March 4th as a country, 1,000 cases a week after that on March 11th. We broke 100,000 cases on March 27th, and then we have added 100,000 to that count effectively every 3 to 4 days since then, passing 800,000 today. This is a graph from WBUR that pulls from publicly available data from the Commonwealth. If you go to mass.gov/COVID-19, they have really been building out their data presentation capabilities throughout this crisis, so that is helpful for folks to understand what's going on in the state. So as of yesterday, this presentation was pulled together before today's numbers. As of yesterday, Massachusetts had 39,643 cases. We had just over 1,800 deaths. And the average rate, this is one of the new data points being made available by the Department of Public Health. The average rate of COVID cases per 100,000 residents in the Commonwealth is 487. So in Easton, as of yesterday, we had 147 confirmed cases. As you and members of the public have seen being reported by local press outlets, we have unfortunately not been spared what the Commonwealth and nation are seeing. And tragically, there are folks who are losing their life to this who live in Easton. We don't have an exact number for that because it does not yet exist, or as of yesterday when I pulled this presentation together, there did not yet exist a formal protocol for municipalities to get official counts on deaths from the Commonwealth. And that's not a result of any kind of failing of the Commonwealth, but that is because the Maven system that is used for tracking illness obviously is concerned with tracking active cases of illness with folks who are still with us, so that it's not a database that's necessarily built to do this type of thing. So we're working with the DPH on that. And if there's a way for us to responsibly and accurately have official numbers on that, we would, in the spirit of transparency, as we have throughout this entire process. But I don't have an official number there. What I do know is that the average rate of COVID infection in Easton is slightly below the state average, which is good news. Our rate per 100,000 is 476. The state is 487, so we're slightly ahead of that curve. And the graph you have displayed here is our case count, which mirrors what you are seeing in the Commonwealth and in the United States of steadily growing. So an update on some of our public health efforts. So the Department of Health and Community Services and Board of Health continuing to respond to COVID in Easton. Their current efforts are focused on inspections of grocery stores and pharmacies to ensure compliance with gubernatorial orders on social distancing, as well as more recent orders for grocery stores to limit their occupancy to 40% of their typical occupancy. We have ongoing case management with Department of Health and Community Services staff being supported by the school nurses who are helping us with contact tracing, and that's been unbelievably helpful. As cases are growing, it's becoming increasingly difficult for our staff to do the necessary contact tracing. And if you're following the news in the Commonwealth, you'll see Massachusetts is leading in this regard. The governor announced a partnership with Partners in Health to build out the infrastructure that we're all going to need in the coming months to have additional human resources capabilities, because this is time intensive to track all the possible contacts of cases. So right now we're working on that with our local staff. We've partnered with the nurses from the Easton Public Schools that have been fantastic in helping build our capacity out that way with existing resources being used in a new way. So that's been a very positive thing. We are continuing to monitor and provide technical assistance and guidance to long-term care facilities in Easton. One of the ways that manifested was, I believe, on April 3rd, after members of the Department of Health and the fire chief had been in communication with one of our long-term care facilities, Southeast Rehab. The management of that facility did request that day, the first day it was available, assistance from the National Guard did come on April 3rd to help build out the testing capabilities of that facility. We remain in daily contact with that long-term care facility and others in Easton. And the National Guard program has been expanded, and additional assistance has been requested by the Southeastern Rehab facility to bring in the necessary supplies so that they can do testing higher population living there, not just symptomatic folks, but everyone, to try to get a better handle on the total spread, which is something that I know Tom works in this industry, but this is something that has been a huge pressure point throughout the United States, that these folks are vulnerable to this illness particularly. And this is the case throughout the Commonwealth. So we are working with partners in Easton to try to connect them up with the state and federal resources that are there to try to help them in management of these vulnerable residents. Public safety remains fully operational. The Easton Fire Department has now successfully executed 48 COVID transports to date under their uniform protocol for doing so, which they established very early on in this crisis, thankfully, under both chief leadership. That has been successful so far. Public access to the fire station is closed until further notice. Public access to the Lothrop Street Police Station remains open for emergencies. Permitting and other managerial and administrative services that are offered by those departments remain available online and by phone. This wasn't built into my presentation. I should have put some photos or video. Many of you may have saw yesterday that Easton Police and Fire participated in a drive-through show of support for the healthcare workers at Good Sam. Something that you're starting to see public safety units around the Commonwealth do, which is a really kind of moving tribute from one group of incredible public servants to another, really reinforcing just how critically important it is that we have the people that we have doing these jobs and being on the front line of this crisis. So there's videos of that on our website and on our social media accounts. It's pretty uplifting. I'm sure we're all kind of in this miasma of kind of fire hose of bad news, it seems frequently. So it was really heartening to see. And I thanked both of the chiefs, and I know the board echoes that, for having their departments participate in that. I think that those little things like that inspire a small amount of hope during really difficult times are really important. You've probably seen some videos floating around of some of our officers and firefighters helping little kids out in the community who are turning 3, 4, 5 years old and stuck at home. And so we're having some of those folks are driving by and flashing their lights for the kids. And, there's nothing kids like more than that. So they're, in addition to being on the front line of the health crisis, transporting dozens of folks with COVID and managing this exceptionally well as police and fire department, they're playing really outsized and wonderful roles in a kind of community service and community engagement manner that obviously far exceeds the four corners of any of their job description. So I'm very grateful to them for that. Personal protective equipment. So as Governor Baker likes to say, we are continuing to chase PPE. We've been successful so far through the Massachusetts Emergency Management Association distribution, the National Guard, and local procurement efforts. We've been able to secure thousands of N95s and other critical PPE for our first responders and other members of town staff who continue to have to work in the community during the situation. So we have sufficient N95s, gowns, gloves, Tyvek suits, shields, and other PPE for our current needs. We've been helped out in a big way by a lot of members of the community, Easton Public Schools, regional schools, Stonehill. There are folks 3D printing face shields. There are folks donating. There are local vendors stepping up and helping with our supply chain needs. So again, in a kind of whirlwind of difficult news, frequently we are seeing a lot of people really exemplify the best of community and public service and helping lift each other and the community up in that way. So it's been really heartening. Any area businesses? I know a contractor who builds homes locally, I forgot the name and I apologize to them, but they realized they had some extra N95s that they will be donating to the fire department. So folks have been stepping up in that way. And if people would like to, if they, for whatever reason, have excess PPE, disinfectant supplies, sanitizers, wipes, any of that, they're always welcome to donate that at Easton Fire, which would be distributed amongst our first responders at 413 Bay Road. And just a final note, public safety thanks the community for its ongoing support. And, they ask that people continue. It's difficult. Obviously, the governor announced today that schools will be closed here, the school year, which is immensely difficult on children and on families. We've been at this for weeks now. It is difficult for everyone, but chasing PPE, getting donations of masks and things like that are critical and are all well and good. But the most important thing we can all do individually is to heed the advice of health experts and maintain physical distance so that we are not contributing to the spread of COVID. So that's very important that people continue to do so. Townwide services, our town offices in Frothingham Hall remain closed to public access until at least May 4th. Just today, the governor announced that all schools will remain closed through the end of this school year. I have not had a chance to review any materials issued since press conference today, but we of course will look at that as well as CDC and DPH guidance. Assistant Town Administrator held a conference call with the Lieutenant Governor today, where they had indicated that a decision will be made by the end of this week regarding the essential businesses order set to expire on May 4th. So we'll keep a close eye on that as well and use all that data to inform any decisions we're making about continued closures of public buildings or service augmentations. Non-emergency personnel who are reporting to the office either to do certain payroll functions that require wet signatures or folks in public works are now subject to non-emergency personnel physical distancing protocols and mask application policies that I've put in place, working together with Health Director Ken and both Police Chief Sullivan and Fire Chief Partridge. Our services are available. Although our buildings are closed to the public, we continue to serve the public both online, by phone, and in limited exceptions, certain appointments for things like dropping off papers. We launched a dedicated COVID information line for folks to call if they do not know what department to reach. We've built out our contact us page with relevant email, phone numbers, and service delivery information for folks. Launched a COVID email for people with general questions if they don't know who to go to. And of course have built out our own COVID page where we keep daily case counts of cases in Easton and have references for folks for a variety of state, federal, and international health organization information so that they can get everything they need from one spot. Public works side of the house, DPW is fully operational. As I don't know what the record is, but we had a major windstorm, I think last week. The windstorm was maybe Monday, and snow. It's all blending, but we had a major windstorm and then a snowstorm. So DPW is still available. They're still showing up. They're doing a great job. I think that's the latest in the season. Had snow. Curbside trash and recycling continue. Textile pickup is suspended until further notice, and public construction is continuing under state guidance. So that's it from me on the general update on COVID. I'd be happy to answer any questions anyone on the board has.
Any questions or comments from anyone on the board? So I'm actually using this from my phone, which is a little bit different than the desktop, but Jackie Wiseman is on as an attendee and she has her hand raised. So I'm going to ask Jackie if she had any comments or questions. I think I've unmuted you. Jackie, did you want to speak?
Dottie, can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Yep.
Hi. No, I didn't have my hand raised. I just want to thank all of you for all your hard work and your continuing service to our town. And if you have any questions for school committee, of course, we can always answer those. But right now, I'm just here as an attendee listening to your update.
Oh, okay. All right. You had a hand raised symbol, so.
Maybe... Well, I'm on my phone, so I don't know.
All right. Thanks, Jackie. I appreciate you listening in today.
Thanks, Dottie.
Okay. If there are no other questions from anyone, let me see. We'll thank you very much for the update, Connor. We appreciate that, and we appreciate everything that our town staff is doing to help us move forward. The next item on the agenda is a discussion and a vote for contract amendment number 1 to Beta Group for Depot Street improvements. Dave, if you want to talk to us a little bit about that.
Sure, Dave Field, Public Works. Again, this is a contract amendment for the Beta Group as part of the Depot Street Corridor Improvement Project. We've had, this is our 3rd contract, and I'm asking you to amend this contract, adding $136,000 to the contract to bring it to a total of $561,000. The reason for this amendment, it was originally intended to get us to PS&E, which is the final documents and bidding documents. But unfortunately, there's been revisions needed due to Mass DOT requirements. they've asked us to redesign various aspects, including right-of-way, drainage, things like that, slowed down the process. And so it's cost us more money to design these changes. And then while we're doing this, we're adding another $30,000 for construction phase consulting, which we would have done anyway under probably a separate contract. But since we're amending this, we're adding it in now. I'd be happy to take any questions you have on this contract amendment.
Any questions from the board?
Just what's PS&E, David?
Oh, sorry. Plans, specifications, and estimate.
Thank you.
So it's the contract drawings, the booklet that goes with it, and the final estimate. That's usually the final phase of a construction design project.
Okay, good, thanks.
David, it's Craig Barger. Are we still on target for state to start work, or are we been pushed back because of this?
We have not been pushed back yet. We are proposed to be funded in the next federal fiscal year. So the federal fiscal year beginning in October. And the goal is that this will be advertised for construction in November. So November of 2020. It does require us to get our land takings in order. And we can't start that process. We've started some of the appraisal process previously, but we're waiting for final MEPA approval, which can only come after our conservation hearing and other environmental permits. That's expected within the next month, and then we'll be before you to authorize land takings, which we get town meeting approval for the funding on, and that's the last step. So we have not been delayed. We're still on the same bidding schedule, and I hopefully we'll have this project under construction next year at this time.
Terrific.
David, is there any risk to that funding given the current state of that we find ourselves in?
Yeah, and we're finding risk everywhere at this point. Generally, this is money that's already been earmarked. So this has already been earmarked as far to the tip. There is no guarantee. A lot of these funds come from federal money, which is tied to gas tax. So, I wouldn't be shocked if there are ramifications, but right now where we're so close on the tip, this money has probably been in the coffers for a while. So I'm hopeful that we'll be able to proceed.
Got it.
And
Okay,
Dave,
so-
just to be clear, the additional funding necessary here for getting the design across the finish line so that this is bid ready, there's already funding that we do have access to now of available Chapter 90 funding, yes?
Correct. Again, sorry for confusion. We're using our own Chapter 90 money, which has already been allocated previously that we've been holding for this purpose. What I was talking about was the overall project funding, which is a combination of state and federal funds, which I hope are not in jeopardy.
Right.
Okay. So if somebody would like to, somebody else have a comment? All right, a motion and a second to accept amendment number 1 to the beta group for Depot Street in an amount not to exceed $136,000.
So moved, Chuck King.
Second, Tom Broussard.
And a roll call vote, starting with Craig.
Craig Barger, yes.
Tom Broussard, yes.
Chuck King, yes.
Mark Lamb, yes.
Dottie Fulgenetti, yes. That's unanimous. Okay,
Thank you very much.
thank you, David.
Thank you, David.
Thanks, David.
Next, we have appointment of Alexander Dros to the Board of Registrars. Hold on one second. Let me get caught up here. So we have a memo from Danielle Sicard, our town clerk, recommend that the select board appoint Mr. Drosos as the Republican Committee representative to the Board of Registrars with an expiration date of March 31st, 2023. Alex was recommended by the Republican Committee. He meets all the requirements and has expressed his desire to serve in this capacity. Danielle Sicard has provided Alexander with a summary of responsibilities, and he has also indicated his willingness to speak with the board if that be of interest. I didn't see him on the call today. I'm not sure if anyone can see if he's joined us or not. But if somebody would, so this is uncontested. If somebody would like to make a motion to appoint Alexander Dros as the Republican Committee representative to the Board of Registrars with an expiration of term March 31st, 2023.
Craig Barger, motion to appoint Alex Drosis to the Board of Registrars as the Republican Committee representative with a term expiration date of March 31st, 2023.
Second.
Tom
Chuck
Broussard,
King.
second.
So that Craig made the motion, Tom seconded. Let's do a roll call vote. Craig, you start.
Craig Barger, yes.
Tom Broussard, yes.
Chuck King, yes.
Mark Lamb, yes.
And Dottie Fulgenetti, yes. So that's unanimous. Thank you. Next is a discussion and vote acceptance of provisions to sections 10 and 11 of chapter 53 of the Acts of 2020 for the extension of real estate and personal property taxes due to May 1st and to suspend accrual of interest on certain bills until June 30th.
Sure. So in your packet, there is a memo from Treasurer Collector Linda Hawks that is requesting that the board vote to accept the provisions of sections 10 and 11 of the acts to address challenges faced by municipalities and state authorities resulting from COVID-19. That is one of the legislative relief packages that the Commonwealth has adopted to provide relief not just to cities and towns, but also to taxpayers who are hurting from the economic crisis that we are in the middle of. So the bills impacted by this are real estate, personal property, excise, trash, and water. And so there's two separate sections of the law and two separate motions prepared here. If you would like to accept these, which I recommend that you do, that do two separate things. Section 10 extends the due date for many of these bills from May 1st, which is the normal due date, to June 1st. So that's still within the same fiscal year. It just gives folks about a month of breathing room in case they need it for anyone who is experiencing economic hardship right now. It also extends the due date for filing for an exemption that is granted to them under the law from April 1st, which we've already passed, to June 1st. So that gives folks, when we were talking about the debt exclusion override, we pulled together a list of resources for folks who may qualify for certain exemptions under state tax law relating to their veteran status, their income, and other qualifying indicators. And so accepting Section 10 would delay the due date of bills by a month and would extend the deadline for file for an exemption until June 1st rather than April 1. That'll give a little bit of relief to folks. And again, as far as the bill due dates, it's still within this fiscal year. Section 11 includes the option to waive interest and penalties for late payments of excise, property tax, betterment, water, or other tax bills between the period of March 10th and June 30. So that would have a small potential revenue impact for us, which the treasurer has estimated between 25 and 97,000, which obviously heading into the crisis we normally would not want to consider, except in this case, this is basically the period of time where many people have had no choice except to be unable to work. So we would propose voting to accept that as well, to waive the penalties on folks who missed a bill payment during this specific period between March 10 and the end of the fiscal year.
Okay, and I think it's important to note that people can still pay their taxes
course.
online. And also there's a drop-off box at the town hall, so, and they can mail payments to town hall as well, or to the address that's on their bill. Anybody have any comments or questions?
Yeah, Dot, this is Chuck King, and I'm just wondering about the mechanism. If this is passed tonight by us, I'm wondering about the mechanism for what's referred to how heavily the allowance is used. How does one use the allowance?
So the allowance, there's no allowance created. That's, I think, just the language used in the memo regarding it, depending on how much people take advantage of. So say somebody, in theory, someone could have the economic wherewithal to pay a bill that is due, and in theory see this and say, oh good, I'm purposely not going to pay until the last possible day. And under normal circumstances, they would have been charged penalties or late fees. So that's quantifying lost penalty and late fee revenue, in theory, that somebody otherwise may be subjected to. But as far as this doesn't change the obligation of any bill payer or rate payer to pay their taxes in full. It just pushes it out a month. But it does eliminate some possible revenue we would generate penalties on people who are unable to pay.
Okay, so they choose to do it in a way by just paying at the extended due date.
Correct, but this would, yes, people don't need to do anything particular. Most people's property taxes, as just a matter of course, are paid out of the escrow accounts for their mortgage. So this should have very little impact on those types of bills. All that this does is extend the deadline for the due date. If you are not someone who either has your taxes set up for auto pay or they're not being paid through escrow, if you don't have a check in the mailbox or received by the treasurer by May 1st, you don't get a penalty fee. You have till June 1st.
Right, it's similar to what's happening in the federal and state level for income taxes extensions.
Correct.
Right, thank you.
Any other questions? Craig, do you have the motion in front of you to read?
Absolutely do. I'd be happy to read it. Craig Barger moved that the select board, in accordance with section 10, chapter 53 of the Acts of 2020, authorize the treasurer collector to extend the due dates of real estate and personal property taxes with an effective date of April 1st, 2020 to June 1st, 2020. Further, for the purposes of exemptions or abatements filed in accordance with Mass General Law, Chapter 59, Section 59, authorize the assessor to extend the due date for submission of such applications from April 1st, 2020 to June 1st, 2020.
Tom Broussard, I second that.
Okay, we'll do a roll call vote, starting with Craig.
Craig Barger, yes.
Tom Broussard, yes.
Chuck King, yes.
Mark Lamb, yes.
And Dottie Fulgenetti, yes. Unanimous. And Craig, if you'd like to read the second motion.
Sure. Craig Barger motion that the select board, in accordance with section 11 of chapter 53 of the Acts of 2020, authorize the treasurer collector to waive the payment of interest and other penalty in the event of late payment of any excise, tax, betterment, assessment, or apportionment, water rate, or other charge added to a tax for any payments with a due date on or before March 10th, 2020, and made after the respective date, but before June 30th, 2020.
And I believe for clarification, that's on or after March 1st, 2020.
No.
March 10th, it says.
I'm sorry, March 10th. I'm sorry, on or after March 10th, 2020. Got it. Tom Broussard, I second that.
And a roll call vote, starting with Craig.
Craig Barger, yes.
Tom Broussard, yes.
Chuck King, yes.
Mark Lamb, yes.
And Dottie Fulgenetti, yes. So that's unanimous. Next up is a discussion and vote regarding the postponement of the annual town meeting and discussing a possible date of June 22nd. and June 29th. So, Connor, do you want to lead into that?
Sure. So under existing state law, Chapter 39, Section 9, select boards can vote to delay a town meeting as long as that town meeting would complete its business prior to June 30th. This has been amended by one of the legislative relief packages adopted by the Commonwealth to allow the board to postpone even further out past June 30th into the next fiscal year, in the event that an emergency poses an immediate threat to the health or safety of persons or property, and if the governor has declared a state of emergency with respect to that. I've attached a copy of the Massachusetts Division of Local Services Bulletin explaining that act, but for purposes of tonight's conversation, we're really focusing on the statutory authority granted to you by the existing state law. And because of the ongoing health crisis, I'm recommending that you vote to postpone annual town meeting from its regular date of May 18th to either Monday, June 22nd or 29 at 7 o'clock at the Oliver Ames High School auditorium. My office has already confirmed the availability of town council, the town moderator, the town clerk for either of these dates, as well as the availability of the auditorium for use. Doing this, as you discussed at your last meeting, would not only provide us with more time to assess the state of COVID, where we are as a community and a Commonwealth as we approach town meeting, and critically, the continuing prohibition on gatherings over 10 people makes a quorum of 100 difficult, obviously. But it will also give us time that we need, frankly, for additional budget planning, which has been necessitated by the economic crisis that we're experiencing. So under the law, as it's been amended, the board could at a later date vote to postpone that June date further into the summer if necessary, due to continued health concerns and a continued state of emergency from the governor. But for now, what I would recommend is a vote to move that annual town meeting from the third Monday in May to the last or second to last Monday in June, for both health and general planning purposes. We've effectively lost all progress that we normally would have made by April. We normally we would have the budget balanced by now, typically, and it's nowhere near that. So I'm happy to take any questions about that. The town clerk, Danielle Sicard, is available if you have any questions for her. But again, I think this gives us some breathing room, and if the health situation does not significantly improve and there continue to be gubernatorial orders prohibiting gatherings that we would need, or if we believe that we cannot safely conduct a town meeting while protecting the health of the public, you would have the option to delay town meeting further, and you can make that decision later.
Connor, it's Craig Barger. Given that the governor today called off school through the end of June, does it make sense for us to even consider June 22nd or June 29th rather than postponing it into July?
I think it does. I agree with you in certain regards that I think it's entirely within the realm of possibility that 100-person meetings will certainly not be happening in June. But setting a date is important from an administrative process standpoint, so that we set some kind of time frame, because we have a variety of statutory processes that the planning board needs to follow, that we need to follow with the finance committee, that there are budget implications for, that we could, in theory, just have no date on the books for now. But I think that would make we're already grappling with an unprecedented level of uncertainty, and I think that would make our jobs more difficult. So I hear you, and I don't disagree, but I think that it is important to get something on the books, hoping for the best, but we will be preparing for the worst. In my budget presentation, we'll get into that in detail. The amended law provides options for cities and towns in the event that we can't safely conduct a town meeting. They have built mechanisms into the amended law that would create what's called a 1/12 budget so that we would continue to have some funding available going into the next fiscal year. But that's kind of a worst case scenario. So we will be planning for that and preparing for that, but setting this date is important for other statutory timeframes that our boards, committees, and departments kind of need to provide the administrative structure to prepare the warrant.
Thank you, Connor.
Any other comments or questions?
June 29th. I think both Connor and Craig are right. And establish a date of June 29th, knowing 99.9% it's going to be moved, but to set the goal because it's right. That's what we need to do. So June 29th is the date I propose.
Just one note on the 22nd and 29th, and Danielle can weigh in on this. I believe you moved your town election into the weekend right before the 29th. Danielle has said that they will make do, and they'll staff whatever is needed. And as you recall, before the crisis, they did 3 elections in 3 weeks. They're obviously a very capable crew. I have some level of concern with a June 29 meeting, and this is all assuming we can have meetings, right? So let's assume we can conduct a town meeting. If we have a meeting on June 29th and the budget is a difficult debate, which I expect it may be, and we can't get it done in one night, that leaves us one day for a continued meeting to get the budget adopted. That doesn't mean it's impossible. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but I think it's important food for thought.
Then June 22nd is fine with that knowledge. Also, considering 99.9% it will be moved into July. But I do understand just if a miracle happened and it did occur and the town election also occurred the next day, then we would have just backed ourselves into a corner. And if there's any chance of that occurring, albeit tiny, it would be best to not position ourselves that way. So June 22nd then.
I would agree
And
with that.
I think it's important just for people at home to know that Danielle is in contact with the clerks. Well, you're still serving on the executive board with the Clerks Association, right, Danielle?
I'm actually no longer the treasurer, but I'm the chair of multiple committees.
Right. So between your work and your connections on the state level and Connor's, and I'm on a policy committee, we have a lot of information coming back and forth on this, and we're actually being asked to provide our thoughts and information on these really important topics. So I think that we've really looked at everything possible that we can do. We know the plan B, the plan C, as much as is available right now, but as soon as things change, we're really in the know of how to move this forward. So I just wanted to thank you, Danielle and Connor, for all the efforts that you're doing to stay on top of it. There's a lot of detail involved in any one of these decisions, have a lot of unintended consequences. So we're really looking at all of those closely. So with that said, Craig, would you like to read a motion? And I believe the consensus was that June 22nd would be the date that everybody would feel comfortable with.
Craig Barger moved that the select board, in accordance with the Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 39, Section 9, delay the annual town meeting from its current date and time of May 18th at 7 p.m. to a later date and time of June 22nd at 7 p.m. to take place in the Oliver Ames High School Auditorium, 100 Lothrop Street, Easton, Massachusetts.
Tom Broussard, I second.
And a roll call vote on that. Craig, you start.
Barger, yes.
Tom Broussard, yes.
King, yes.
Lamb, yes.
And Full Janetti, yes. So that's unanimous.
Thank you, Dottie. We will get that information put online so folks can know to expect that. Danielle did put a great amount of information out after your vote on moving the town election. That has been very helpful. And I just want to reiterate what you said, Dottie, that we as a community and an organization benefit greatly from Danielle, not just in her professional capacity here, but when this legislation was being drafted, the Attorney General's office personally contacted Danielle to be a part of that conversation because she is so reputable in this field. We benefit greatly from that. So I wanted to take a moment to say thank you to her.
Thank you, Danielle.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Danielle.
Danielle.
Thanks, Danielle.
Appreciate that.
And Danielle, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, and we'll have
All right.
certainly a lot of emergency response planning to do for both the election and the town meeting, but we will make it as safe as we can when we do it.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Okay, next on the agenda is the town administrator update for the fiscal year 2021 budget outlook. Connor and Wendy, is Wendy going to be presenting also?
Wendy is here and is available. I'm going to lead the presentation, but it's very data heavy and very dense. So hopefully there's a good conversation and lots of good questions. And Wendy is here to help make sure that we get all those facts right.
Okay, so after we go through each section the way that you had it presented, maybe we could take a pause and see if there's any questions before we get to the next part of it.
Sure, I'm fine with that, and that will prevent me from having Rubio-esque water grabs while speaking throughout this presentation. So thank you, Dottie. So this is a relatively detailed presentation. I'll try to be succinct without skipping over things that matter. So obviously we are in a period of significant economic volatility as a nation, as a Commonwealth, and that of course trickles down to local economies and to municipal financial planning. So it's important to start summarizing and making available the information that is available so we can start framing what will probably be some pretty difficult conversations in the coming months relating to finance. So the intent of this presentation is to do that. It's to summarize existing information available from economic experts, what is known during this significantly volatile time. You know, these are basically caveats that are important, admitting that there's still far more unknowns than there are knowns in front of us when it comes to the economy. The goal of this presentation is to provide a preliminary assessment of the scale of possible challenges that we could face resulting from the COVID recession that we are now in. Like any modeling, the projections are only as good as the data inputs that are available. And in this case, admittedly, those are limited because the situation is changing so rapidly. These figures are preliminary. It's to inform discussion, and it's going to be revised substantially as this situation evolves. The presentation is a bit text and data heavy, but that was done purposefully so that this document will be complete, and people who are not watching this with narration will be able to go through it and come to their own conclusions from the information that I am presenting without, you know, my talking head floating in the corner to try to translate it. For that same reason, I've included citations for everything that I am putting in here, unless it is internal data from our own finance department. And I think that that's really important. This is not me claiming to be the economic authority for a global financial crisis, but it is me trying to do my job to aggregate and translate other experts' opinions on what may be likely heading our way to inform you as policymakers and the community as we head into the next fiscal year. And finally, again, I can't stress this enough, this isn't a final budget. Although normally I would be delivering a final budget to you by the end of April, this is not that, and we're going to get into all those reasons now. So this presentation is going to cover just a quick recap of what the fiscal 21 budget looked like before the COVID crisis. And we're going to use that as what we're calling a baseline, just to inform the conversation about where we may be now that the COVID crisis has hit. I'm going to summarize key economic indicators on an international, national, and local level that are relevant to municipal financial planning, to basically give a recap of what has changed financially since the preliminary fiscal 21 budget in February. From there, I'm going to walk you through Wendy and I's process for building a forecast for fiscal 21, covering the many things that are unknown at this time that we need to keep an eye on, what we actually do know, and what actions we've taken already early in this crisis. And then doing a recap, a really important one, I think, and talking about lessons that we can take from the last recession that many of us worked through, and that has really had a profound impact on the way that we run our business in municipal government since 2008. From there, I'll close with a couple of scenarios, give a sense of scale of what we might be looking at, and closing out with what we need to work on. And as Dottie said, I'll stop for questions with every section. So just to recap the baseline of where we were with our projections for fiscal 2021 before the COVID crisis, you see here is a summary. You have revenues on the top half, expenses on the bottom half. The second from the left column is what our revenue and expenses were for the current fiscal year to 2020 budget. The next column is what our preliminary 21 budget looked like when we released it in February. We had a marginal proposed increase to revenue of 2.78%, some pretty minimal growth in state aid, which has been typical. And we had a preliminary increase in expenses of 4.13%. So our preliminary budget had a deficit of just over 1.1 million, which is not unusual. And we usually spend the time that we've now all spent on COVID response on whittling the budget down and bringing it into balance by trimming back everything that we can and running departments as lean as we have been doing for 13 years. So since the state of emergency, a couple of non-COVID related things have come to fruition and clarified, which they typically would during this time of year for the budget process. And that's reflected in the next column, non-COVID related revisions, March 2020, on the expense side. So we did get our health insurance rates from the GIC for next year. At first, the forecast looked worse than what we now have. It is still an increase, but it is from our preliminary projection, but it is not as dramatic as we had originally thought. So we are looking at a 4.91% increase there. That's a difference of 38 grand, minor change in some regional assessments, and the elimination of a snow and ice deficit. So we were projecting a snow and ice deficit for fiscal 21. We had a pretty mild winter, and we thankfully will be able to eliminate that $100,000 deficit going into next year. So the net there is really marginal. It's 51 grand. So the revised 21 pre-COVID budget baseline is a deficit of 1,052,000. So again, this is going to be the baseline that we work with for this presentation. We are projecting a total increase in revenue over last year of 2.264 million and a projected increase in expenses of 3.3. So we're still looking at about a $1 million deficit before this situation occurred. Does anyone have any questions about the recap of where the budget stood before the crisis? Okay, moving on then. So what's changed since then? So I'm going to start with the kind of 10,000 foot view and work my way down to the local level. So starting with a summary of key national and international economic indicators. In March, many of you may have read, and you'll see here all these blue links are all linked directly to the data sources, so anyone can go check them. In March, the St. Louis Federal Reserve estimated that national unemployment could hit 32% in 2020, and you see that graph on the right just to give you a sense of scale. That would be worse than the unemployment rate in the Great Depression and more than triple the peak unemployment in the Great Recession in 2008. March retail consumptions across the United States has dropped, the most it has ever dropped in 1 month as a response to stay-at-home orders across the country of 8.7%, and really significantly for our universe, auto sales in March dropped 25%. Auto sales are very important to those of us in municipal government because excise tax are one of our largest sources of local receipts. So that is not good news. On April 1st, Standard & Poor's Global revised their economic outlook for all United States public sector finance to negative. On April 14th, the International Monetary Foundation published an article that, again, is linked here, and I recommend anyone who is interested in this kind of stuff go read it, forecasting a global recession brought on by COVID to be the worst since the Great Depression. They revised their global economic annual growth forecast for the calendar year of 2020 to a 3% contraction of GDP globally, which is down from their January 2020 assessment, where they were significantly more optimistic, where they were projecting a 3.2% GDP growth figure for 2020. So it's a swing of 6.2 points, which is pretty large and concerning. We have now had 4 weeks of jobless claims data published by the Department of Labor and the Bureau of Labor Statistics. In the United States, as you can see on this graph, that it almost looks like the vertical axis is broken, but it is not. Between March 26th and April 16th, there have been a staggering 22 million unemployment claims filed by our fellow Americans, which is equal to roughly 14.5% of the US labor market. Obviously, one of the main unknowns about this recession is the stickiness or the duration of these job losses. Some more optimistic forecasts are hoping that most of these, if not all, would come back. Others do not project that. But regardless of that, while we are in this crisis, to have that percentage of the labor force not working is a massive hit to the economy that has impacts on our budget planning. These 22 million job losses eliminate, at least for now, all jobs created since the last recession. So 12 years of job growth has been effectively eliminated in 4 weeks. Nothing like this has ever happened in the history of the United States. These job losses in 4 weeks are more than double the total lost jobs during the 2 years of the 2008 to 2010 recession. So in 4 weeks, more people in the United States have lost their jobs and filed for unemployment than 2 great recessions put together. And you can see that. The graph here shows you have the recession of 2008 right up until 10 showing the peak weekly jobless claims in March of 2009 hit 665,000. And as we know, the week of March 28th, 6.8 million people filed for unemployment. Some more important national economic indicators. So I'm going to start trying to pivot to translate these national indicators into things that relate to our budgeting particularly. So tax collections for states, including Massachusetts, which in turn fund local governments through things like Chapter 70 education aid, unrestricted general government aid, bonding programs, and a variety of things. Those tax collections, which are built off of sales tax and personal income tax and a variety of other taxes, typically plummet during recessions. And the graph on the bottom left shows that. But you see every vertical column in gray shows a recession, and particularly the recessions in 2002 and the most recent one in 2000, the Great Recession in 2008, tax collections dropped 6% and then 8% for state tax collectors. If the coming recession mirrors this, the US-wide, the nationwide state budget shortfalls could exceed the shortfalls in the Great Recession. So you see a chart on the bottom right, which has been pulled together by the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, showing in inflation-adjusted terms the annual shortfalls for total state tax collections during the two most recent recessions, as well as what they are projecting for the shortfalls that we may see based on the current jobless data and other indicators. And so they're projecting, just in the current fiscal year, which only has 3 months until close, a nationwide shortfall in state tax collections of $105 billion. And next year, projecting up to $290 billion in lost state tax collections across the United States. And this comes from a policy paper of theirs called States Need Significantly More Fiscal Relief to Slow the Emerging Deep Recession. That's linked right there. I recommend everyone read it. That is an ongoing conversation between municipal, state, and federal leaders relating to ongoing efforts to provide financial stimulus to city and town government. You hear a lot about things like bailing out airline industries, private corporations. The $2.2 trillion CARES Act included $150 billion in funding for states and local governments. However, there is significant red tape attached to that funding that in its current iteration makes it ineligible for us to use to offset revenue shortfalls. It can be used for other specific and restrictive items, such as unanticipated COVID-related expenses that come up during this calendar year, which is, of course, helpful and we are appreciative of. But as it currently stands, the federal stimulus, the $2.2 trillion federal stimulus in the CARES Act that allocated funding for cities, towns, and states, that funding cannot be used to offset revenue shortfalls in this or next fiscal year to support our existing services. So more will need to be done there, and we'll talk a little bit more about that.
Honor, it's Craig Barger. I noticed today that the Senate was talking about the possibility of additional money being added not only to the personal protection payroll plan, but also to cities, to states, and thus cities and towns. Do you have any sense of whether that might change so that the exclusions that are currently in the $2.2 trillion CARES Act will change so that we can use the money for lost revenue or to offset lost revenue?
So those are two separate pockets of money, both contained within the CARES Act. So the PPP program, as it's called, for small businesses, that ran out of funding last week. There's conversation about whether or not that funding should be opened up to local governments in the form of loans. I haven't followed that closely enough. I will dig into it. The conversation about the CARES funding, the $150 billion, just being made more flexible so that it can be used for revenue to offset revenue shortfalls, that is a conversation that is happening. The National League of Cities today submitted a letter to the Congress and Senate and to the President requesting that either the CARES Act funding be interpreted by the U.S. Treasury, who's responsible for administration of this program, to be more broad and allow us to use those funds as we need to support our existing critical services, or for a supplemental legislative package of additional funding that is less restrictive to be adopted. So there's conversations about those things happening. Neither of them have yet. I will closely monitor them and keep you and the public informed. So,
Thank you.
You're welcome. Moving into a summary of state and local economic indicators. Similar to the United States, Massachusetts has seen significant jobless claims in the same 4-week period. 572,000 Massachusetts residents have filed for unemployment. That's roughly 15% of our workforce, which is actually a greater percentage of our workforce than what you're seeing nationwide. For a sense of scale, the peak unemployment rate in Massachusetts during the Great Recession, which again, I think we all talk about it a lot, but it's worth reminding, the Great Recession was one of the worst financial downturns since the Depression. So it's an extreme benchmark to be using. It wasn't a typical recession. And yet what we are seeing in 4 weeks is a impact of the labor force in Massachusetts that exceeds what the peak, and nearly doubles what the peak unemployment was here during the Great Recession. On April 2nd, the Pioneer Institute for Public Policy released a really good detailed paper about unemployment in Massachusetts and how unemployment correlates with state tax collections and therefore the ability for governments to fund services that we need to fund. Again, that's linked there. I recommend folks read it. But one of the real major bylines on that was that they were projecting that Massachusetts could hit 25% unemployment by this June. On April 14th, the chairs of the House and Senate Ways and Means Committees, as well as the Director of Administration and Finance for the Baker administration, held a virtual economic roundtable where they had a panel of economic experts, both internal to the state government and external, folks from Standard & Poor's, Moody's, the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation, Treasurer Deb Goldberg, and many others for almost 4 hours, testified to a lot of what I am trying to consolidate to much less than 4 hours tonight. That video footage of that is linked here, but some of the major impacts for the state of Massachusetts that were discussed and presented at that roundtable was a possible $0.5 to $1 billion revenue shortfall for the Commonwealth for the current fiscal year. A possible depending on which economist, $2 to $6 billion shortfall for tax collections for fiscal 21 compared to the consensus revenue forecast that was set. So the consensus revenue forecast is the number that state lawmakers set usually around December of a given year to basically say, we agree that based on the economic data available, that our revenue as a Commonwealth will go up by X% next year. And so we're going to use that as our target for matching a spending plan to that to create a balanced budget for the coming year. So what I'm saying now, what I'm trying to synthesize here is that, and you see this with a table on the right, you have the fiscal 2021 tax revenue forecast. This is from the Massachusetts Taxpayer Foundation, and it's informed by Moody's. Significantly, it's informed by Moody's optimistic scenario, and I'll get into that in a minute. But they're showing in the leftmost column the consensus revenue forecast. These figures are in millions, so you see 17,900. That's 17,900 million. So the consensus forecast for the Commonwealth that they were building their budget off of was that there would be state tax revenue equal to 31 billion in the coming fiscal year. The revision to that from the Mass Taxpayers Foundation is that that number will probably be closer to 26.7 billion, which is a shortfall of $4.4 billion, or to put it in simpler terms, 14% below what was being planned. It doesn't matter what budget you're talking about, whether it's your house, your town, your state, or your country, a possible 14% shortfall is incredibly, incredibly serious. One of the anecdotes that came out of that testimony last week that is not getting as much attention as the headline figure I just said of 14% shortfall in tax collections is that the lottery is faring understandably poorly right now. Folks are not going out and purchasing tickets and things like that. And Treasurer Goldberg noted that weekly lottery sales in the Commonwealth right now are down 30% compared to last year. And we talk about the lottery a lot in Easton because the lottery funds the second largest category of state revenue, which is called unrestricted general government aid. So if the lottery is going down 30% in revenue, obviously that's a weekly figure, but if this continues through the end of June, you're talking 3 to 4 months of major revenue decline for the program that funds our second largest source of revenue. So that is troubling, to say the least. That revenue source, unrestricted general government aid, as a matter of policy, the Baker administration has benchmarked unrestricted general government aid to cities and towns to the consensus revenue forecast. So remember, we just talked about how the consensus revenue forecast for next year was going to be 31.1 billion. There are now economic experts forecasting that that may be going the other direction by 14%. So in a normal year, if the consensus revenue forecast for the state was an increase of 3%, we would get an increase in unrestricted aid of 3%. The Baker administration has not said this, so I'm not attributing this to them, but if that same logic applies when the revenue goes down, that would be significantly damaging to our revenue next year. So for these reasons, the state budget process essentially needs to start over. there is no existing consensus revenue forecast anymore. This is a summary of that Max Taxpayer Foundation report that I referenced a couple of times. It's linked at the top of the slide. This one really kind of hones in on the impact for the Commonwealth. So that report, as I've stated, is projecting a possible shortfall in tax collections for the Commonwealth of 4.4 billion next year. It's 14% compared to what they were anticipating. What is really important is that these assumptions are based off of Moody's best case scenario, which assumes that the pandemic breaks, and this is a quote from the paper from Moody's, the pandemic peaks in April and abates in June. And that recovery begins very quickly in July. So since this report was published on April 14th, we now know that the Commonwealth has kept schools closed through June. So this financial model from the Mass Taxpayers Foundation is assuming that the pandemic abates in June. This leads to what you will hear called, if you haven't heard it already, the V-shaped recovery that folks are talking about. And that is, the V-shaped recovery is just simply a shorthand for talking about the shape of the economic rebound. And in this case, looking at Moody's Analytics forecast of employment levels in the United States. So that chart is available on the right. Under a V-shaped recovery, which again is the best case scenario, the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation is projecting that unemployment in Massachusetts would hit 18% in June. Remember, as of last week, we're at nearly 15%. So we're gaining on that quickly. Mm-hmm. And they are also projecting that even though it's called the V-shaped recovery, I think what gets lost when people talk about that is assuming that the second peak goes right back to where the prior peak was. So if you look, you see calendar year 2020 quarter one at 152 million jobs in the United States, and then a drop down to 144, and then the bounce back. But the bounce back doesn't go all the way up to 152 million. What Moody's is projecting is that we would recover perhaps half of the jobs lost quickly, and that the rest of the jobs will take years to fully come back. And you have the blue line is that V-shaped recession assumption, and the dotted orange line is the more typical modest or U-shaped recession. Whether it was a rapid recovery starting as early as July or a more typical slower recovery, the U-shaped recovery, the Mass Taxpayers Foundation report states that pre-crisis level job recovery may take several years, projecting autumn of 2022 under the rapid recovery and autumn of 2023 under the U-shape. A couple of other notes that are really important. If you look at this graph, which is dated March 27th, which under the current rate of change may as well be eternity ago, the employment forecast from Moody's, upon which this Taxpayer Foundation analysis is based, assumes that the trough, the pit of the employment fall would be 8 million jobs. So you see the high point of 152 million, and then the blue line drop down to 144. That's 8 million jobs lost. However, we now know that since this has been published, that 22 million jobs have been lost. Their analysis, Moody's analysis, also assumes the passage of an additional, as of yet to be determined, federal stimulus package in the summer or fall of 2022 to provide billions in additional economic relief. Sort of to Craig's point, there are obviously ongoing conversations about this. Congress has shown a great willingness to appropriate historic and incredible amounts of money to try to fight this crisis right now. But so those are two very large assumptions baked into this recovery model from Moody's. And if neither of those pan out, then you may be looking at the dotted line of a slower recovery, taking longer to recover jobs, taking longer for people to get back on payrolls, taking longer for those folks to be paying state income tax and to be resuming their consumer spending habits that support sales tax and other critical revenues for the Commonwealth. So an important piece here just to frame this in a perspective of talking about the budget for fiscal 21 is that under the V-shaped rapid recovery scenario, the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation is projecting that after hitting a peak of 18% unemployment in June, that Massachusetts would still, although recovering, have an unemployment rate at about 7% at the end of next fiscal year. And as you'll recall on one of the last slides, that is not significantly far off from the worst peak unemployment in the Commonwealth during the Great Recession. So before talking about trying to synthesize some of this with other information we know, does anyone have any questions about the summary of these economic reports?
I'm good. Thank you, Connor.
Okay. So I thought it was important to really lay out how much we still don't know. So in the immediate term, between now and the end of this fiscal year, things that remain unknown. We do not know what our collections, we don't know what the Commonwealth's or our collections for fiscal 20 are going to look like on most of our revenue categories, whether that's meals tax, which we can assume will go down, excise tax, building permit fees. There will be impacts on Q4 revenue collections that we simply just cannot know until they happen. Any major shortfalls in revenue collections in the current fiscal year will create significant difficulties in us meeting our financial obligations for the current fiscal year. And what we can almost take to the bank is that we have seen diminishing free cash certifications for years. That will be exacerbated by this circumstance. What else is unknown immediately is that we are going to have to produce, if we intend on producing a budget at all for July 1, which it is my intent, we're going to need to revise that fiscal 21 baseline in a really volatile and fluid situation that you normally do not want for planning $80+ million budgets. So we are going to have to rely on, and I'm recommending this because I'm sensitive to just bringing all bad news and no recommendations to people. No one likes that. We're going to need to rely on a lot of historical data analysis, particularly looking at previous recessions to inform the possible scale of revenue shortfalls and cuts that we may reasonably anticipate. Hopefully we don't have that, but we need to be ready. We need to analyze the limited available data, including actuals for our accounts for March, which is currently underway. But even that, much like the unemployment rate for the United States, that's an obfuscated picture that doesn't really belay the real challenges we're looking at, because most of the real shelter-in-place type policies didn't go into effect until the second half of that month. So we need to look at March, April, and depending on when a budget is done, May collections to inform our local receipt forecast for next year. We need to understand and plan for stabilization fund use, because it is very likely that unless all of these economic indicators are wrong, which I would be thrilled if they are, but if any of them are remotely close to reality, we should be planning and preparing for use of reserve funds, of stabilization funds to mitigate revenue shortfalls, while also mentally preparing ourselves that it's unlikely that reserve use alone is going to completely insulate us from expense cuts, given how extraordinarily lean all of our budgets already operate. And we're going to have to resist the urge to spend down our collective reserve capacity in fiscal 21 alone in a manner that can't be sustained for multiple years, because one of the things that history has taught us, and I'm going to get into this in successive slides, is that regardless of the speed of general private sector economic recovery, the damage to state and local revenues is significantly longer lasting. So we are going to need a multi-year plan for weathering this storm. Other items that are in the unknown category between today and the end of the fiscal year are the stability of any kind of capital planning. So fiscal 21 capital budget is uncertain. The municipal bond market is volatile. Financial advisors have basically told municipal issuers, which includes you, don't even bother trying to sell notes this spring because of how unstable things are. So the bond market is volatile, and we are really, really, really going to think very carefully about using any dollar of free cash at all for capital items, unless they're emergency items, because we're going to need every dollar that we have to try to preserve services. So I'm recommending, and I will put a capital budget together that effectuates this if we have a town meeting in June, that we postpone all non-emergency capital items to fall, at which point hopefully we have a clearer picture of borrowing capacity and our reserves. Town meeting postponement. So again, it's unclear to all of us when the pandemic will subside to a degree where public meetings with hundreds of people are possible. If you ask the governor of California, he says not until 2021. We don't know. So I'm recommending that in addition to the development of a fiscal 2021 budget, assuming that we make that June 22nd town meeting, we are going to need to have a no town meeting contingency budget based on the recently enabled 1/12 budgeting authority that one of those state legislative relief packages made possible for cities and towns. So that is kind of a worst case scenario, but we need to be prepared for that. If nothing else, the past few months have taught us that.
Connor, can you just explain for people at home what the 1/12 budget means?
Sure. So under the revised state law, a provision of municipal finance law that used to exist for schools now exists for town government in general, where if our town meeting cannot meet and therefore doesn't adopt a budget for the fiscal year starting on July 1, you necessarily, we have bills to pay, we have staff to pay. Those things don't just go away because a budget was not adopted. And so what a 1/12 budget is basically a extension of the fiscal 20 budget into fiscal 21 on a month-to-month basis with authorization from the State Department of Revenue. It's a 0% budget, so it's level funded. And it's 1/12 of the annual appropriation rather than all of it at once, which has significant implications for certain bills that come due all at once, such as our pension assessment or other assessments. So there's some consideration for that built into the amended law. Wendy and I gave a lot of feedback to the state as they were writing it. That made its way into the bill, thankfully. But so what a 1/12 budget is basically, it's a fancy way of saying you carry over your existing budget plan into the next year on a month-to-month basis. Did that answer your question, Dottie?
Yes, thank you.
So unknowns, looking at a more mid-term lens, looking at the whole of fiscal 21. When you look at that baseline assessment for what our budget would look like for 2021, the fixed costs and assessments were largely programmed before the COVID crisis. So as the board is already aware, fixed costs are costs over which we have little to no immediate control. They include things like charter school assessments from the Commonwealth, regional school assessments, mosquito control assessments, health insurance rates set by the GIC that regardless of our ability to control them locally, we have an obligation to fund them and to pay them in full. They, on the expense side, create a lot of pressure that is then exacerbated on the revenue side by our structural revenue deficit, where we are basically squeezed every single year and have fewer and fewer dollars available to fund actual services for the public. So fixed costs always present a budgetary challenge for the town, and normally they're pretty much baked in by this point. However, given the scale of challenge we might be facing, all of those need to be reassessed anyway for us to identify any possible relief for any of these expenses, whether it's regional school assessments, the charter school assessments from the Commonwealth, which, as you recall, really hurt us in the current fiscal year. Our insurances, including health insurance, as well as debt service strategies. In addition to a general stabilization fund that we maintain and have been building up significantly in recent years, the town has a capital stabilization fund that we rarely touch. But given the circumstances we find ourselves in, it may make sense, and Wendy and I will be looking at this closely in the coming weeks and months, to possibly use some capital stabilization funds for necessary emergency cash capital purchases in June that cannot wait till the fall, rather than using free cash. Other unknowns, again, back to the conversation we were having, additional federal support will very likely be needed. We needed it last time. The Great Recession, the stimulus package, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, provided, I think in Easton's case, nearly $1 million to offset cuts to state aid in one of our fiscal years. It was not recurring. It didn't hold us harmless forever, but that makes a world of difference. And currently, the $2.2 trillion CARES Act does not have a corollary. It doesn't have anything comparable where there's a meaningful source of revenue that we can tap to offset the likely shortfalls that we will experience from state and local revenues. So I cannot stress enough, if nothing else comes out of this budget presentation, it is that we need more help from the federal government. Again, this links to a great policy paper on that topic. And my recommendation there is that all of you as leaders continue to engage with our legislative delegation on the state and national level, as well as through your policy groups, to keep that conversation going and to amplify it. Today, the National League of Cities called on Congress for this exact type of support to either amend and loosen the restrictions on the existing funding for cities, towns, and states, or to adopt another, I think, $250 billion stimulus to help protect us and protect our ability to pay police, firefighters, and teachers when communities need them more than ever. So that is of critical importance. But at this time, it's unknown whether that will happen. And one of the largest unknowns as far as it impacts our ability to plan is the timing of the Commonwealth's budget. So as I stated before, that they, like us, basically need to restart their 21 budget from scratch. The timing of that is still unknown. So while they did have an economic roundtable, which was itself delayed by a full week due to technical issues, they have not yet, unless it happened today and I missed it, released a roadmap for an expected timetable for their budget, which has really big implications for us, including that the Commonwealth may not have a budget by the end of this fiscal year, and that is something that has happened in the past, and it did happen in the last recession. And when our second largest source of revenue as a municipal government comes from the Commonwealth, it makes it very hard for us to plan when a 8-digit revenue category does not have is not set for us to plan on. So my recommendation, and we're already doing this, but just to document this, is that we're going to continue to closely track that state budget process, hoping for the best while preparing for the worst. And in this case, the best case would be that a fiscal 2021 budget for the state is revised, if for nothing else, just for revenue consensus and setting some expectations for us within the next 4 to 6 weeks, and therefore can be used to program our budget in time for a June 22nd town meeting. The worst case for us as budget planners would be the absence of a revised 21 Commonwealth budget, which would necessitate that we build ours relying on modeling. Or another worst case would be that we do get numbers and then they are cut mid-year, which again has happened in prior recessions. So we're going to be working on that for the coming months. So the common themes that have emerged so far from these national and regional economic forecasts, as well as from the testimony to the state last week, are as follows: that under the best case scenario assumptions, like that V-shaped recovery, experts are forecasting unemployment rates in Massachusetts and in the United States greater than those during the Great Recession of 2008, with the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation forecasting more severe drops in tax collections than those that we saw in 2008. The general consensus amongst those experts last week was that the shape of recovery, whether it's a V or a U, remains unknown, and that we're not really going to know until it's happening, and that those experts were saying midsummer and perhaps fall. So there's not going to be clarity as much as we all want and need it. What is known, and it is a common theme, is that the CARES funding has significant limitations. It has too many for us, and it can't be used to offset revenue shortfalls or to fund and sustain existing programs. And another common theme that emerged from the testimony is that we don't know enough about the health crisis we're facing, that the lack of universal and widespread access to COVID testing, coupled with unavoidable unknowns about the nature of the virus itself, including seasonality, make it difficult for epidemiologists to forecast when the virus will subside, which then in turn makes it really difficult to have any kind of fact-based long-term economic projection for any kind of complete reopening of state or national economies. We're going to be kind of feeling our way through the fog here for the foreseeable future. I cited a report here, not to try to depress everyone more, but that many people probably saw headlines about, and I felt was worth including. That, again, this is the first non-economic report I cited in this, but it's worth including that the Harvard School of Public Health last week was reporting that they believe that it's not outside the realm of possibility from a public health standpoint that intermittent social and physical distance measures may be necessary through 2022 until a vaccine is available. And if that's the case, then the economic impacts that we're seeing are going to continue in some form. Does anyone have any questions about all the things I just admitted that we don't know?
I do not.
No.
No.
So we're going to move towards looking at how to build a forecast model given the multiple pages of things we don't know. So in order to try to even inform a preliminary forecast, a revenue scenario during such uncertainty, I'm going to cover what we actually do know right now, and a recap of our experience in the last recession and what we can learn from it. And then I'll close out with some scenarios for fiscal 21 informed by both. So what do we actually know? So we know that we may as well take the February preliminary 21 budget and put it in a shredder because the assumptions that informed it don't apply anymore. We know that economic outlooks generally are bad. They are varying flavors of bad, but they are generally bad. We know that even if the economic impact is not as severe as those forecasts are showing, that at a minimum, having this level of uncertainty during budget planning is bad. We know that the current federal stimulus is insufficient, and therefore we know we need to start our budget over. So what have we done so far, outside of throwing our hands up in despair? We, on both the town and school side, have implemented emergency financial controls. Spending freezes have been put into effect. I will be fully transparent, as I always try to be, that discretionary spending is not really a thing for us. Our budgets are so lean already after years and years of cutting since the last recession that it is not as if we have rich, large expense accounts for any department. So it's important that we minimize and freeze spending, and I have done so, and we have done certain things such as not purchase existing approved capital items that are needed, but are sourced from free cash so that we can maintain 20 grand here or there for those purposes. But we, nonetheless, instituting a spending freeze is important. We've implemented hiring freezes for non-emergency personnel and non-health personnel. The town, immediately upon it becoming available, sought and received approval from the Department of Revenue to establish a COVID-19 deficit spending account that was authorized by state law. And so what that basically does is it creates a account that we can track spending that is directly in response to the COVID crisis, whether that's overtime for public safety, whether it's for procurement of N95s, gowns, disinfectant, whether it's for materials for the Board of Health agents to provide to folks who are in quarantine. We can put those in the COVID deficit account, and that has two benefits. One is that those are the types of spending that may actually be covered by the CARES Act, so that could be helpful. Two, if not covered by CARES Act funding, they may be FEMA reimbursable, which Chief Partridge is on top of, as always. And if both of those fail, the deficit is allowed to be amortized over 3 years, which helps us spread that out. This is similar to what the Commonwealth did when we had that particularly bad winter, I think in 2014 or 15, where we and all other cities and towns were able to spread the pain of that out over 3 years because the scale of that was global and could not have been reasonably foreseen. So we sought authorization for that and received it immediately. You tonight took action to delay certain due dates for bills to help provide some breathing room to many of our residents who are suffering from the financial woes that I just spent some time covering. And town and school leaders have been and are going to have to stay continuously engaged with our state policy boards, with the Massachusetts Municipal Association, with our delegation on refining and providing feedback to ongoing legislative relief packages, as we have been doing, whether it's Danielle or me or Wendy, the chiefs, the superintendent, or the newer push on additional federal stimulus. So we've been working at that every day. So that's what we know about next year. So we needed to look back and take some important lessons away from the last recession. So I'm going to kind of touch on, and again, I apologize for the length of this presentation, but for everyone to get. What we can learn from the Great Recession is that public sector job growth was effectively non-existent for 13 years. So it remains unknown how long-term the economic impacts from a COVID recession will be, but this is still informative. So we have for many, many years heard reports covering the longest period of private sector job growth in American history, which is a fact, and that is good news. However, there was two recoveries that happened after the Great Recession. There was the private sector recovery, and then there was the public sector recovery, which wasn't. Nearly all job growth since 2008 has been in the private sector. Through the end of 2017, private sector employment in the United States rose by 18 million jobs, while the United States public sector, that includes federal, state, and municipal jobs, were still 87,000 below their pre-recession levels. So after almost a decade, during which we had one of the longest sustained periods of economic growth in our history, public sector employment did not recover. According to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, through February of 2020, so this is 2 months ago, private employment had grown, as I just said, the longest in our history of 120 straight months. But total government employment in the United States, federal, state, and local, was barely above what it was at the start of that expansion following the recession. Therefore, and why I'm telling you this and why this matters, is public sector employers like us are heading into this next recession having barely recovered the human resources that we lost the last time. Absent significant federal stimulus to support local governments, cities, towns, school districts across the nation, there are very few managerial levers we can pull on to deal with large revenue shortfalls outside of reserve spending and painful cuts. Doing so to balance the budget during a global crisis is regressive in that it would be harmful to the public at a time when they need public servants and the services that they provide the most. So 2008 was a financial crisis. We now have a financial crisis predicated by a global health crisis. When there are health crises, you need public servants, whether it's police, fire, health directors, teachers, school nurses who are helping with contact tracing. These people are all incredibly valuable every day, every year. They are exceptionally valuable and important to trying to protect the community during a time of crisis. So heading into this recession, having not fully recovered the jobs in this sector that were lost after the last one, while we need those services, is difficult. What else we learned from the Great Recession is that state tax revenue collections lag behind job recovery. So as you'll recall, I pointed out that the Mass Taxpayer report is projecting possible state revenue shortfalls of 14% next year. If we look back at the last recession of 2008, despite private sector job growth trending positively within 2 years of the onset of that recession, and that's shown in the graph in the bottom left, Massachusetts income tax collections took 5 years to get to pre-recession levels. That actually also happened in 2002. And that was part of the testimony provided to state leaders last week, is that in the two most recent recessions in 2002 and 2008, it took 5 years on average for state tax collections to recover to where they were before those recessions hit. So it's, of course, great, and it's good news that employment began growing after 2 years in 2008, but that growth did not touch the public sector, and it took 5 years, not 2, for state tax collections in the Commonwealth to recover. Another lesson we can learn is that state aid revenue to Easton lags even farther behind that. So it took 5 years for Massachusetts tax collection to recover to pre-recession levels. It took us 8 years from 2008 to 16 for our revenue from the state to recover after that recession. So the recession took 2 years before job growth came back. It took 5 years before state tax collections came back. And it took 8 years before our revenue from the state came back. And that's not adjusting to inflation. Without adjusting to inflation, our current net state aid in the year we're in, fiscal 20, has grown only 5.9% in 12 years. When you adjust for inflation, we never recovered. If you look at our fiscal 2008 revenue from the state, and you adjust that using the Bureau of Labor Statistics data for inflation, what was about 11.25 million in 2008 is worth roughly 13.8 million today. Today's actual net revenue from the state is below 12 million. So if you adjust for inflation, we're 17% below where we were in 2008. More lessons that we learned in the last recession was that reserves and the past override, many, many years ago now, mitigated cuts that the town had to enact for our expenses, but that we still had borne out of that a structural revenue deficit, and that still exists today. So heading into the last recession, Easton benefited from having an operational override and a boost to our stabilization account as part of that override in 2007, immediately before the economy melted down. And that's marked clearly on this graph with the green arrow on your left. Unfortunately, the recession era cuts to state aid and local receipts wiped out any gains that override provided, which you start seeing in fiscal 9. So this graph, you see the blue and or orange, those represent reserve dollars being spent in our operating budget. You see that the year of the last operating override, which was 2007, we spent effectively nothing in reserves, which makes some sense. In 2008, we still spent effectively nothing. But then in 2009, cuts to state revenue began, and we started offsetting those cuts from the last recession using reserve funds. However, as we just touched on, it took 8 years until those state dollars came back, not adjusted for inflation. And so that problem, born out of a 2-year recession, turned into what's now a 13-year structural revenue hole that the town has been struggling with. We have, particularly in the past 4 years, aggressively cut down on our use of reserve funds in the operating budget. Thankfully, the board adopted a fund balance policy in 2016, and in those 4 years, we've cut our use of reserves in the operating budget in half, and we've doubled our stabilization fund balance to the highest it has ever been. However, during the 2008 recession, we spent down our stabilization fund, and that's the graph shown on this page, from its peak in 2009. In the course of 9, 10, and 11, we spent down about 70% of that fund in only 3 years. So again, that was after an override. That was after a major transfer into that stabilization fund, and we, from that recession, had to spend down nearly all of it in 3 years, and there were still service cuts. So we know that in a coming recession, we have to use reserve funds judiciously, understanding that we're not going to be able to offset all revenue shortfalls with reserves alone, and that we can't spend all of it in 1 year, lest we deplete any capacity we have to weather this in successive years, which the past few slides have demonstrated we are going to need. We can reasonably deduce that from our experience in the past and have history inform us that even if we have this optimistic V-shaped recovery based on Moody's model, we're looking at a severe hit to revenue to the Commonwealth, possibly in fiscal 21. And we know that after broader economic recovery has happened in the past, it took years for the state's tax collections and for our state aid to recover. So to summarize, our financial position now compared to where it was heading into the last recession, we have done, and it hasn't been easy, but it's been the right thing to do. We have significantly improved our fiscal standing, and particularly in the past 4 years. As I mentioned, cutting our reserve use in half, doubling our stabilization account. Those are things that we should take pride in. And it was for times like this. I wish we had more time because despite those successes, in many critical aspects, we are heading into this next recession in a weaker position than we were in 2008. Our reliance on taxation is significantly higher now than it was in 2008. Back then, before the Great Recession, it was 66% of our revenue. Now it's 73%. Our state aid position is worse. In addition to having an override right before the last recession, our state aid was increased by 9.2% over the prior year. As you all know, we frequently see 1% now, or in net dollars, a cut. So we were heading into the last recession with the override and with a 9% increase in state aid the prior year. The current fiscal year we are in, our state aid in the net was cut by almost 2%. Our structural revenue deficit is worse now, although we've made massive progress in 4 years. In 2007, Easton had a $3.4 million override to build reserves and to support services. We have not had one since then. As many of you recall, just prior to this crisis really hitting, the budget subcommittee had identified that another override would be necessary in Easton just to support our existing service levels before this crisis hit. As part of that analysis, the budget subcommittee demonstrated, and it's available online, and that's what that link goes to, that we have, as an organization, cut everything we could to the bone during and after the last recession to try to mitigate the impacts of that structural revenue shortfall, which therefore means that if we need to cut because of the coming recession, that it will be more painful and regressive than the last. While our revenues did not recover quickly, our service needs did not ever get cut. Our level of service needed and what we provide has gone up, not down, since the last recession. And as I touched on earlier, a health crisis really brings into focus the necessity and the value of our public servants across education, general government, public health, public safety. These folks are doing essential services to try to look after and promote the public good and the public health. We've built out our capabilities in nearly all departments, despite all of the revenue challenges we've had in the past 13 years. And the current crisis magnifies what those needs are. And finally, we're heading into this likely, or S&P was blunt. They just said we are in a recession, so I'll defer to them on that, not me. We will be heading into this recession with a lower reserve ratio. So while our stabilization fund is at the highest it's been ever, it's all relative. Our expenditure levels are higher. So we were in a better position in 2008. And here's a summary. Heading into the last recession, our appropriated general fund expenses were about 56 million. And our total reserves was 4.1 million. So that meant that we had reserves on hand, we had cash on hand equal to about 7.3% of a year's spending, which is, as you may recall, within the parameters we have set of a goal. We want to be between 7 and 10%. That's our goal as a community. And we've been working back towards that. But we are currently at 6%. So we've been rebuilding since the last recession. We've been making positive progress. 6% is the highest that our reserve fund ratio has been since 2008, but we're not fully there yet. So while our reserve level is higher now, the highest it's been, it's 4.6 million, our stabilization account. This says 2.8 million, that's last year. We're now over 3.2. We still are not at 7%. So despite all of those relative strengths that I just identified for the last recession, the override, the state aid increases, the reserve ratio, we still spent down our stabilization account from 2.9 million down to $800,000 in only 3 years. We spent 72% of that capacity in 3 years to weather that last recession. So does anyone have any questions about those takeaways from the last recession that we worked through?
None here.
Okay.
Nope.
So taking all of this and trying to synthesize it into some approximation of a model. So the first step in any budget planning process is to develop a revenue forecast. We have to balance our budget every year by law. We're not like the federal government. We cannot deficit spend outside of exceptional circumstances like COVID accounts. So our expenses are predicated on revenue. It's just a fact. It's not a statement about the value of relative expenses. It's just our job. We have no choice. We must balance our budget. So we start our budget process with revenue forecasting. Typically, we do that in the fall, 7 or 8 months before the coming fiscal year. We now have to start that process over with more uncertainty than ever and with significantly less time to work with. So to start that conversation, rather than effectively just wait and do nothing, Wendy and I developed a preliminary fiscal 21 revenue forecast model that uses the assumptions that we talked about tonight. On the local taxes front, we make no changes to our assumptions. We still project that under any scenario that the tax levy in Easton will be levied to the limit allowed by law. And that the levy would go up by 2.5% next year plus new growth. The real changes in these scenarios are on state aid and local receipt projections. So we have 2 scenarios. The first one is a relatively straightforward one. It's a level funded scenario of what would our budget look like? What would our revenues look like if state aid and local receipts were level funded at the current year's levels, no growth. The second scenario is a little bit more involved, but hopefully the logic is relatively straightforward in that we looked at the 2008 recession. We quantified Easton's actual cuts, both in local receipts and in state aid. And we made a function of how much was cut for us locally based on how much revenue the state lost. And so as you may recall a few slides back, I showed that the worst year for the Great Recession for the state, they lost 11%. That was their worst year, an 11% shortfall in tax revenue. And the current economic projections from the Mass Taxpayers Foundation is that fiscal 21 will be a 14% cut for state tax collection. So we came up with a function of, if state revenue falls by this much, how much does Easton's revenue fall by? And we extrapolated that into next year based on the Mass Taxpayer Foundation's projected 14% shortfall. So again, I can't stress enough, this is preliminary. It's a forecast. It's meant to inform this conversation and to illustrate the possible scale of challenges that we are going to face. But this is a revenue conversation. I am not talking about expenses at this point, nor the schools. And this isn't a final budget document, but it's important nonetheless. So here's that first scenario, which is a more simplistic model. It is, you just take our local receipts and our state aid from fiscal 20, and you roll it straight over into 21 with no change. And so if we move from category to category, it's the same as the first slide of a presentation. You have our revenue categories are in the top half of this table. Our expense categories are summarized in the bottom half of this table. You have the fiscal 20 levels there, and at the bottom you see a deficit of nothing because we balance the budget. You have the fiscal 21 pre-COVID baseline. That's the one that we talked about earlier, where we were working with a projected preliminary deficit of 1 million and change. And then you have the percent changes to each of those categories. Move over to the right again, and you see the assumption level fund, chapter 70, general, state aid, and local receipts, and the impact that that has on revenues. And so in this case, with the more simplistic model of just assuming a level fund for state aid and local receipts, you're looking at a loss of revenue next year for Easton of $280,000. That brings our total projected revenue increase to just shy of 2.5%, and that would increase our preliminary deficit from 1 million to 1.33 million. Does anyone have any questions about this forecast?
When you say level fund, how hypothetical is that? Because we have contractual changes. We have things that we can't control, like the cherry sheet. So
when I'm saying level fund, I am speaking explicitly and only about revenue, not about our expenses. If you look here, under both of these models, we are holding our preliminary fiscal 21 expense forecast constant, which is an increase of about 4%. So we're not touching expense assumptions at this time. So when I say level funding, I'm only talking about changes to revenue.
And that's assuming that our state revenue is going to be the same or go down?
The same. So this model is a kind of middle of the road. In my opinion, this is basically for illustration purposes only. The model is the next one. But in this case, it's assuming that our state aid in fiscal 21 just stays constant at fiscal 20 levels. No cut, which is in and of itself not the worst possible assumption, because if we know the current fiscal year, the net state aid was cut before this crisis.
Okay.
Okay, so we'll move past this onto the more kind of data-driven scenario. So this is our preliminary revenue forecast for next year that takes that function I just talked about of if we are to see proportional cuts to state aid and local receipts in Easton that we saw last time there was a recession and double-digit % drops in tax collections for the state. Wendy and I feel pretty comfortable that this is a reasonable ballpark for us to start talking about. Again, this is going to change a lot. This is built off of assumptions and modeling. It is not final, but it's important for us to start getting a sense of scale. So this table is the exact same as the last one. Revenues are on the top. That's the only thing being touched. Expenses are being held constant at the pre-COVID projected increase of about 4%. What you see here, if you go to the column that says cut chapter 70, general state aid, local receipts, is a loss of revenue of about 1.7, almost 1.8 million compared to fiscal 20, or I'm sorry, compared to what our baseline was. And so the net result there would be cuts to state aid, state revenue of approximately 7.75% for next year. That's 1 million for state aid, and about a $500,000 cut compared to current levels of local receipts. So the net result there is that instead of a preliminary deficit of 1 million, your preliminary deficit is 2.8 million. Again, this is holding expenses constant. And this is not yet applying additional reserve fund use, but I wanted to illustrate that and make this point that that deficit of 2.8 million, the projected deficit, if we have similar cuts to the last recession of 2.8 million, already assumes the application of 900,000 free cash dollars. So the true shortfall in revenue is closer to what's shown on this, which is about 3.8 million. So this is our graph that we use every year. This is a visualization of what the gap has been every year between recurring revenue in Easton and our expenses. And you can see that it was trending down for many years, and that we were projecting using only 900,000 in one-time money in fiscal 21 before this crisis, which would have been the lowest we've done since 2009. Now, what these cuts are showing are demonstrated here, scenario 1 and 2, that you're looking at magnitudes greater than anything we've had to do ever. So possibly a simpler way to put it is scenario 2 is assuming 82 million in revenue. Scenario 1 was assuming 83.5 million. And the pre-COVID budget was assuming slightly more than that, about 80, just shy of 84 million in revenue. So that's what we're looking at for now as a preliminary kind of level setting expectation. So what that would look like on the whole, if we had those cuts to state aid and local receipts, which would mirror our experience 12 years ago.
Connor. Question, Connor, on scenario 2.
Sure.
So scenario 2 has state aid at a reduction of 7.8%. And I appreciate that there is a function and a calculation, but can you connect that to the 14% decline in state revenues that are projected, and why the impact to us would only be 7.8% in your model versus potentially higher?
Sure. So the last time, the worst year that the state had was an 11% decrease, Tom, in the last recession. And what we saw immediately after that was not an 11% cut. It was about a 7% cut. So that function roughly translates out to this 8% for a 14. However, something that's important and what's buried in the point that you're making, I think, is that it could be worse. And an important of that cut last time was we had a 7% cut, and then the year after we had another 4% cut. So it actually got to 11%. Just took 2 years. Wendy, is that a fair approximation of your model?
Yes. Yes, and I think it's important to stress that this could very well be worse.
Yeah.
Just as a large dollar comparison, Connor, what is the status, the dollar amounts in the reserve funds total?
The stabilization account has roughly 3.2 million in it.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I know we're talking round numbers, Connor, but even my quick math says if the last correlation was 11% state reduction, 7% impact to town revenues, then if the correlation held perfectly, 14 would be to an 8.9% reduction. And I'm not questioning your logic. Mm-hmm. I will be the first one to state, as somebody who builds complex models like this, that our models that I am involved with change daily, and that the amount of effort to keep them updated and to keep them thoughtful about all the new pieces of information at this time is it's massive. And so I'm not being critical. I'm just pointing out some additional thoughts of observations for the team overall that just, I think, adds some color that your 7.8%, again, not in any way wrong, but my quick math says it could be a relationship of 8.9%.
Yep, thank you. Like you've said, this is preliminary, and we are not purporting that this is a predictive analysis that we can take to the bank and build a budget on, and it very well could be in excess of this. I think there was some other moving pieces there qualitatively, like the application of federal stimulus money last time, that are not necessarily captured here, but we will incorporate that when we revise this.
Right. And again, also just want to point out that that 14% drop is based on things starting to bounce back in July.
Correct.
And that's probably not likely.
I would agree.
Does anyone else have any questions or comments? I mean, to Tom's point, we're happy to get feedback on this. This is very early. We're not building a budget on this, so there are gaps in what you think I've identified. I want to hear them.
I think that's a great point, Connor. All I can say is that these discussions, these financial discussions, first of all, you did an incredible job communicating in a massive amount of information to us as an audience, and you did so in a thoughtful way that I felt could make it it could be followed well. So thank you for that. I will say to the entire audience that this is the start of a conversation, to Connor's point, and feedback is critical, engagement is critical, because there will be an incredible fluidity, I'm sure, to this process with all the information that is to come, the changes that will happen daily, to Connor's point, the updates we will receive. The more we are able to engage in a meaningful way, and this is an incredible presentation to build a foundation off of, Connor, I am so appreciative. The more we can engage along the way, I think will enable us to get to the best possible place in the future. And from my perspective, that best possible place will still be an incredibly challenged position that will take an incredible amount of thought and engagement.
Okay, I'll close out then with just kind of touching on what's next. So our spending and hiring freezes are likely to hold for now. Wendy and I will be closely monitoring March and April actuals to see if we can glean more useful information to inform our local receipt projections than just using historical models. Town meeting has now been delayed, so we can check that box. I will be building a capital budget that effectuates number 4 and postpones non-emergency capital items to fall. I'll work closely and sensitively with department heads on that. An item I know of concern, I think Jackie Wiseman was on this presentation earlier, is we understand the schools had to do extraordinary measures of providing laptops and technology for kids at home that would not normally happen in a given year. I obviously consider that to be an emergency capital item responding to this health crisis. Not everything is necessarily, an ambulance to be an emergency item. We're going to continue monitoring the state budget process. We're going to stay in constant contact with state and federal leaders and our state policy boards. It's really important that we continue to all stay tuned in on this and stay as smart about this as we can, even though, to Tom's point, it's exhausting. The level and pace of change is unlike anything we've worked through. We need to aggressively advocate for what it seems to be true right now, which is that we will need additional help from the federal government. This is not an Easton problem. I should have stressed that at the beginning. This is not, there's nothing inherently deficient with what we are doing. We are trying to read the tea leaves like everyone else here and look through the fog. But there is a lot there appears to be a lot of economic pain coming to city and town governments around the country, and absent significant and coordinated response from the federal government, we're gonna have really difficult choices to make. So we need to be aggressive and clear in our advocacy for support, because we need to support the services that support the people who live here, and need funding to do that. I will be reassessing all operating budgets across the board with every department head and labor leaders, who are going to be an important stakeholder in this in the coming months. Wendy and I will begin formulating a multi-year reserve fund drawdown strategy so that we can responsibly tap our reserves that we've spent years building up, to try to spread them out in a way that can mitigate pain to the maximum extent possible in the short term without being irresponsible about the likely long-term impacts of our decisions there. We are going to continue to refine our model and get more feedback. But again, this is not this. There's a reason I didn't call this a budget change memo or budget change document, because it's not. We just do not know enough, and it would not be responsible of me to formally say on April 21st, this is what the budget will look like on July 1. I don't know. But as soon as I know enough, I will do a formal revision and bring it to you and the public. And finally, we're going to need to prepare multiple kind of onion peels of contingent budgets that have to plan for a variety of contingencies, both financial, as far as maybe the state doesn't have a budget, maybe it does and the cuts are bad, maybe it doesn't, there's no cuts, that'd be great, or maybe we can't have a town meeting because the threat of COVID remains significant enough that gatherings are prohibited. So Wendy and I will be working on crafting a variety with all of you and with the schools and all the stakeholders, once we know enough, a variety of budgets to fit those different scenarios. So we have a long and difficult road in front of us, and I take no pleasure in saying that, but it's my obligation to try to start setting four corners on a conversation about this sooner rather than waiting until the end of June to do and act surprised. So I hope this was helpful, and I'm happy to take any questions anyone has.
Any questions from the board?
Connor, just one question. I apologize on the 1/12 budget.
Yep.
Is that, I know that we can spend more perhaps, but do we have to spend at least a 12th?
Wendy, do you want to?
Yes. Yes.
So I guess my point, my point is then, if we do have to spend more than a 12th and that process goes for 3 months, and then we find out we have less revenues, we've spent a lot of our revenues in the first 3 months relative to what would be available for the next 9.
Yes, Wendy, correct me if I'm wrong, and Tom, correct me. What I think I hear you asking and saying is, especially if we're projecting cuts in revenue, right? Cutting below the funding level, a 1/12 budget may actually be more money than we're going to see.
Exactly.
So if we spend the full 1/12 in each of those months, it is feasible that if we wait till fall to balance the budget for setting the tax rate, that we spend more than a quarter's worth of our available revenue in 1 quarter, and therefore we need to cut deeper in the next 4 quarters. Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Yes, and Wendy, that's
exactly.
possible,
Right.
yes.
And the first few months will be more than 1/12, just because there are certain expenses that we have to pay up front in the beginning of the fiscal year. We have to pay the pension assessment. That's $4 million. We have a lot of debt service that's going to be coming due in either July or August. So we'll have to make sure we have sufficient funds for that.
Yeah.
And also we pay our insurance up front so that we get a savings from that.
Randy, it's Craig Barger. Those 2 points, is it conceivable, possible that there's a negotiation that goes on regards to the pension and regards to insurance that says we don't have the revenue, and nobody has the revenue at this point, so we want to spread this over a period of time, not dissimilar to what people are doing with their mortgages, about not paying for 2 or 3 months and adding it on to the end of their 15 or 30-year timeframe?
We could do that, but it will cost us more money. We save about $90,000 just to pay the pension assessment up front at the beginning of the year. Spread it out like we would typically do in years past into 2 semi-annual payments. We would just end up paying more. So that's why we've done that, because it saves us $90,000 to do it that way.
Right, and Craig, that's a great point, and we actually used that exact example when we provided formal feedback to the legislature on this bill that allowed the 1/12 budget, specifically requesting that it be built into the bill, and I believe it was, that we could seek approval from the Department of Revenue, and Wendy, correct me if I'm wrong, but that if we did a 1/12 budget, we could seek approval from the Department of Revenue to pay in full some of those obligations, which would exceed our 1/12 amount, so that we don't basically get penalized, right? Because if we had to spread our pension payment out, we would spend more money. $90,000 is more than the salary of a health inspector. I mean, that would be crazy for us to do. And the DOR and the lawmakers appear to have responded to that, incorporated that relief into the bill. Which is a good thing. But as far as the pension funds in general, Wendy, I don't know if you've been in contact with the county pension system, but I'm sure that they are going to more than ever want payments up front, given the impact of their fund balances of their investments, right?
Right.
So we talked a lot, Connor and I, about before this presentation came out, about exactly, how much information, and it's really important. It's a lot of information, especially to digest in one meeting, and especially with so many unknowns. But we think it's really important for transparency. Sorry about that. For transparency, that people understand the way that we're painting the picture and how we're arriving at some of these conclusions. And the only way to do that is to look at it from the beginning, look at the history, look at all of the data that has to be explored as we're going into this, and then see all of the scenarios that we have to look at. Like Tom said, these are massive calculations that every time something changes, everything else has to change. For that matter, every time the governor gives an announcement, we have to create policies, and everything has such a ripple effect in this situation. So I hope that people are watching this. I hope that they'll look at it on ECAT and send us your questions and comments and thoughts and ideas. And we're happy to incorporate any answers to those questions into future meetings as we go along. But this is really, really important stuff. And I hope that people really do take a look at it. So, any other comments and questions? All right. So next we have town administrator notes. Connor, did you want to add anything, or do you think we've covered everything so far?
All right, just one quick thing. In accordance with your resolution on March 16th, I did execute one contract that normally would be voted on. I coordinated with you on that, Dottie, and I provided a digital copy of it to the board. It was for 2 vehicles for the police department that are necessary for their ongoing operations. These funds existed already. They were appropriated in fiscal 20, and they were funded out of available FEMA reimbursement funds that were earmarked for public safety expenses. So that contract was executed. It's on file. You have it. Funds are there. The form is appropriate. I don't know if anyone has any questions or concerns.
Nope.
Okay.
I want to do the minutes, and then I just want to go around to all the select board members to see if they have any final comments. So we have minutes to accept from April 3rd, 2020. If somebody would like to make a motion, a second, and then a roll call vote to accept those.
Craig Barger, motion to accept.
Tom Broussard, second.
And a roll call vote starting with Craig.
Barger, yes.
Broussard, yes.
King, yes.
Lamb, yes.
And full Janetti, yes. And just want to start with you, Craig, if you had any final thoughts or comments, just in general.
Sure. I number one, I want to thank Wendy and Connor for the work they put into this presentation. I know that it's difficult and I suspect uncomfortable. I also think that it is important, piggybacking on what you were saying, Dottie, about community and transparency and involvement, is that, as you recall, last year when we had to make some difficult decisions, people stepped up and said, how can we be helpful going forward? And I think this is an opportunity for us to generate support from the community towards increased federal funding with fewer restrictions on the use of the money. We happen to have a congressman who, despite the fact that he's running for Senate, who has been very responsive to the folks in Easton and is part of the leadership in the House in Washington. And I'm hoping that people will reach out to Representative Kennedy and ask him to push hard for increased money for cities and towns in Massachusetts with fewer restrictions on the use of that money.
Great, thank you. Tom?
I would agree. I think those were excellent points by Select Board Member Barger. You know, it's first of all, appreciation for everything that those people in our town do for us. Connor, your team, all the department heads. It's just been incredible to see the amount of effort that has gone into this. And I think our town is well served by all of that effort, and it's deeply appreciated. I do think that Craig brought up a great point that it's going to be important we engage the community. I believe that we're going to have some very difficult discussions, and the better we can be in terms of providing information, to your point, Dottie, and create transparency, to create involvement, and to create engagement. I have every confidence that our community can come together and support each other at this time to help us get to the best place possible. And absolutely, to Craig's point, I believe advocacy is so important. It is important we reach out to our state representation. It is important we reach out to our federal representation. I think it is important to continue to support the efforts that Connor and the team are putting forth in order to be leaders within our state and our community at this time. Credit to Danielle for receiving the call. And I know in so many ways that the leadership of our town plays an active role in where we net out from a state perspective. And I'm deeply appreciative for that. So that's all I have to say.
Okay. Thanks, Tom. Chuck?
Yeah, there are a couple of quick points, Dot. And one is that speaking about the variables of the unemployment is that I don't even know how one would factor in what industries are going south in regard to this. What kind of vocations will be changed? It just seems like I can see some elements of the massive data and changes that are involved. The other is a personal comment, is that I recently, it's in regard not to my health condition, but it's in regard to stating the kind of things that our public safety people do. And I was at the Goddard Hospital not too long ago, and I had the misfortune of spending like 12 hours in the emergency room there. And I'm fine. It was a little hiccup, but the point is that I was there for 12 hours with one of the most difficult patients I've ever seen or heard of. And one of our ambulance crew was there working and helping. And I've never seen such patience from a young man in dealing with this difficult patient who had severe medical issues. And he just symbolized for me what our public safety department, the kind of things that our public safety department does on a regular basis. That's it.
Thank you for sharing that, Chuck. That's really important for us to remember that. Mark?
Yes, my comment is more along the lines of what Chuck was saying. Connor, you and your department heads, Danielle, Wendy, you guys really have not let up off the gas for 6 weeks. You have become incredible leaders during this. And I think now more than ever, we need to support one another because we're not even close to getting through this. We're in the midst of it. And I thank you for everything you're doing, all of you. And I offer my support to any one of you in any way, but to stay strong and stay the course and don't let off the gas.
Thanks, Mark. So I would just, I keep trying to look for some positive things to help me mentally and emotionally get through this tough period, professionally and personally. On the town side, I think that we've done some amazing things over the past several years to be responsible and be prepared for should something happen like a recession. No one ever dreamed it would be under these circumstances, but I think we all felt that there'd be a market correction in some way. And so when we voted to have fiscal policies and make responsible decisions on our spending and our saving, the money that we've saved for solar and insurance and energy and changing street lamps and all of those little steps along the way have been so important to have us as prepared as we can be right now, to have our stabilization at the highest that it's been. And, it's a real credit to everybody involved in that and to the people in the town who vote for these things at town meetings. So I really think that those are great positives. I think, I'm hoping that every day we're just getting one step closer to finishing this. And I think that everybody in our own way, we're at different points in how we learn about this, how we absorb the information. Today was a really, really tough day for a lot of people in our town, for our kids, for our teachers, for our families. And yet I saw so many positive comments about how we'll get through this together and, fun ways that we'll do things together as this moves along. So I really appreciate that. I appreciate it from our staff. I appreciate it from my fellow board members and from our families in town. So I would just say, to be patient and to take care of each other, look out for each other. And when you can lend a helping hand or say a kind word, those are the things that I think we'll look back on in this time that will be really important. So that is all I have to say. And unless somebody else has something, I would take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
So that is Chuck and Tom. And let's do a roll call vote. All in favor of adjourn, starting with you.
Barger, yes.
Broussard, yes.
King, yes.
Lamb, yes.
Full Janetti, yes. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
you.
Good night.